Welcome back to Soils 446, 546, Drinking Water and Human Health. This is lecture number 15. I'm going to start talking about microbial contaminants. This is my first lecture on bacteria, and the focus of this bacteria is the disease cholera. To give you an idea of what we are going to try and cover with microbial contaminants, we're going to cover drinking water and infectious diseases, bacterial infections. I'm going to talk about cholera or Vibrio today. Next lecture, coliform bacteria, and some of the other microbes. So let's take a look at drinking water and infectious diseases. Disease-producing bacteria were the first contaminants of drinking water recognized to pose a threat to public health. It's these organisms which caused problems for humanity back to the start of the human race. They weren't recognized as specific pathogens until the late 1800s as we moved into the progressive period. The first standards for microbial actions in drinking water were published in the United States back in 1914. There was a recognition that drinking water that was contaminated passed infectious diseases between people. Since the beginning of the progressive period in the 1880s, much progress has occurred. And this has occurred because of two factors. First, we have been able to take sanitation measures in our water supplies. When we dump human waste back in the waters, it's treated first. And then we have been able to purify the water we take out of rivers prior to passing it out to the public. These two measures have really resulted in a large reduction in infectious diseases. If we look at the United States, we still have problems with microbes. Still, today, over 200,000 children that are less than 5 years old are annually hospitalized for diarrhea, and a lot of this diarrhea is due to bacteria in drinking water. As a matter of fact, a recent study indicated that about 40% of the cases of diarrhea are due to the ingestion of contaminated water. Now, not all of this water is drinking water from the tap. It might be water from a pool or a water slide or something like that, but it's still very significant as a public health problem in the United States. So let's take a look at microbial problems. Despite our progress since the 1880s and 1914 and improved sanitation measures, we still have problems with outbreaks. If we take a look at a period of time not that far ago, if we look at a period of time in the U.S. between 1971 and 1988, there were 564 documented waterborne infectious disease outbreaks. Now, these 564 outbreaks resulted in impacts for over 140,000 Americans. So that's a little slice of time. If we move forward a little bit and we go back 25 years, look at the period of time in the United States, CDC data from 1993 to 1994. In that 2-year period, we had 5 major outbreaks in 4 states. And these were big outbreaks. So just in 1993, 1994, about 400,000 people became ill, serious enough to actually kill 50 of the 400,000 people that became ill. We get this data from the Center for Disease Control, or the CDC. The CDC estimates that over 900,000 Americans become sick each year from drinking water that is contaminated by microbes. That's even with the fact that 85% of the public get water from public water systems. Consequently, the EPA has developed standards for microbial contaminants, but we only have standards for the major microbial contaminants today. We have 4 basic categories of waterborne infectious agents. and we'll be talking about them through the next 4 or 5 lectures. That includes the bacteria, which we'll be talking about today and in our next lecture. Our parasites, which we often refer to as protozoa. Our viruses, which we don't know very much about. And algae, which we simply don't have very much data on right now. So even though we've been working on microbes for well over 100 years, we're almost clueless with viruses and algae in drinking water, or the impact of viruses and algae on human health when they're present in drinking water. So let's talk about the bacterial infections today, or a portion of the bacterial infections today. Bacteria are microorganisms that belong to the kingdom Prokaryota. I'm sorry, my pronunciation is pretty bad. These organisms are microscopic, they're single cells, and we find bacteria every place. They're ubiquitous. It means we can find them any place. They live in soils. For instance, it's believed that a gram of soil has about 1 billion microorganisms in them, and at least half of them are bacteria. We find them in water, and that's our interest in this course. We find bacteria in organic matter, and we find bacteria in the intestines of animals. Now, not all these bacteria are bad, but some of them are pathogens to humans, and that's where our concern is. Generally, when bacteria appear in places that they normally don't reside, they can cause illnesses in humans. Common bacterial problems are known as diseases that we've all heard about. We may not be very familiar with them, but we've all heard about them. We've heard of cholera. We're going to talk about cholera in this lecture. Typhoid fever, dysentery, and diarrhea. Those are just 4 problems that bacteria present in drinking water can cause. So let's talk about the first one. That's Vibrio cholera. We just simply know it as cholera. I gave you the scientific name, but everybody just simply knows it as cholera. Technically, cholera is an acute intestinal infection. It's traditionally spread by eating food or drinking water that has been contaminated by the fecal waste of an infected person. So let's spend a little bit of time on cholera. Cholera can be very common in parts of the world. In many third world countries that lack pure water supplies and or proper sewage disposal, cholera outbreaks are very common. If you take a look at what goes on in the world, occasionally you hear about a major cholera outbreak. Often cholera outbreak in less developed countries and even middle developed countries are common after major natural disasters. For instance, a few years ago, we had an earthquake in northern Turkey, and the first concern was cholera. When people broke pipes, water pipes got broken, they got contaminated with sewage, and all of a sudden you had a cholera epidemic. Cholera is very common, occurs after natural disasters, and you can even see it in some highly developed countries after natural disasters. So it's one of the things that we have to be very vigilant about. Now, even though cholera may be fairly common in less developed countries after disasters, if we go to highly developed countries, it's pretty uncommon. It's uncommon today to see it in the United States or in other highly developed countries like Western European countries or Japan. In the U.S., it's most likely to happen when people eat raw shellfish from polluted coastal waters. So it's more common to get cholera from eating raw shellfish than it is from drinking water in the United States. So cholera in the United States, again, the major source is raw shellfish. If we take a look at data in the U.S. over the last 30 years, going from 2014 all the way back until the late 1980s, we find that about 95% of the cases of cholera that have been documented in the United States are, first of all, they're mild. They result in few problems. People get sick, but they recover. Only about 5% of those cases result in severe diarrhea and dehydration. And usually, these 5% of the cases that result in severe diarrhea and dehydration only occur if there isn't proper treatment. If it isn't properly treated, you get severe diarrhea and dehydration. And if you totally ignore it, there will be the occasional death. But there's really no justification for people to die of cholera in the United States, since it's not really present in our drinking water supplies, and you get cholera by choice, by eating raw shellfish and things like that. Historically, if we take a look at cholera, throughout recorded history, it was common for tens of thousands of people to die from cholera epidemics. Epidemics from the beginning of time all the way through the 1860s were pretty common. We've seen historical cholera problems throughout the world. We've seen these epidemics in Asia. We've seen them in Europe. We've seen them in Africa. And even today, there's still a major problem in the developing world. Technically, cholera is present on most continents in the world, and we are actually going through the end phase of a major cholera pandemic. A pandemic is basically a worldwide epidemic. Scientists track the beginning of this pandemic we're going through back to about 1961, and it's still going on. It's kind of shut down, but some people still think it's around. We can trace it through historical medical records. We know that in 1961, cholera appeared in Indonesia, and it slowly spread to Eastern Asia. So it spread to Eastern Asia, and from Southeast Asia, it spread to Bangladesh in 1961. And we can track this cholera pandemic as it continued to spread. It spread from Bangladesh in 1963 to India in 1964, and then further west in 1965 to the USSR, Iran, and Iraq. By 1970, the cholera pandemic, because it's worldwide, had reached West Africa, and it was found in places in Africa that it had not been seen for over 100 years. So it was spreading. In 1991, it had actually reached Latin America. So if we look at the Western Hemisphere now as part of this pandemic, between 1991 and 1994, remember it reached Latin America in 1991, between 1991 and 1994, over 1 million cases of cholera were documented in the Western Hemisphere. These cases, when treated fast, people just got sick. But at least 9,600 people died in Latin America and the Caribbean from cholera. This provided a fatality rate of about 0.9%. Now, this can easily be controlled. It can easily be controlled because the pandemic was basically spread in drinking water. All you have to do is treat drinking water with a chemical that will kill the cholera bacteria, such as chlorine. That's what we do in HDCs. That's why we're not seeing or we don't expect to see the pandemic in North America because we routinely treat our drinking water with chemicals that would kill bacteria. And remember, cholera is transmitted by a bacterium. If we look at cholera in the United States, again, most of it comes from shellfish. We see about 74 cases on average. That's been the average number for the last 20 years. Now, I mentioned that shellfish are a major source of cholera in the United States, raw shellfish. That's true, but it's estimated that of the cases that are diagnosed on an annual basis in the United States, a lot of the cases, probably over 95%, are associated with foreign travel. People that have been overseas and drank water or been exposed to cholera, they come home and then they're diagnosed. One hotspot in North America is the U.S.-Mexican border, and that's because along the south of the Rio Grande, along the border, we have sewage that's not treated. And remember, raw sewage would have fecal waste in it, and that's where we find cholera bacteria. We can easily control this by simply that if we use that water for drinking, we need to chlorinate the water to kill the cholera. So in summary, for cholera, this is basically a worldwide problem. We're seeing cholera in water supplies, and these water supplies need to be treated so people do not pick up cholera. We simply have to treat the water. We treat the water, we shouldn't have cholera problems because the bacterium that spreads cholera is very susceptible to simple chemicals like chlorine. Now, if we live in North America and we travel a lot, if we travel to MDCs and LDCs, one of the things they tell us is don't drink tap water in these countries because oftentimes tap water is not treated to the standards that we're used to in the United States. And there may be some pathogenic bacteria, including cholera, that are still present in the water supply. So drink bottled water. Cholera is a historical problem, but we have the technology to deal with it. Cholera has ravaged humanity for thousands of years, but we have the water treatment technology to prevent the spread of cholera and to keep people well. Very simple, straightforward. Later on, as we talk about microbes, we'll run into a few microbes that are not that easy to take care of. They're not that easy to kill, and consequently, we still have problems in drinking water. But from the cholera standpoint, this is something very easy for us to control. Thank you for your attention.